traditionally published author. So is anyone familiar with what that term means? So traditionally published is, there is a publishing house in New York that, and I have an agent, and all of this was a tremendous shock to me when it happened. My previous career is in information technology, and I worked in IT for 35 years. I have a Bachelor of Science in Business Management, and okay, so high school students here, ignore part of what I say. That degree is doing me no good right now because I'm doing this. But it's, you know, you never know. They say once you're published, it's hard to stay published, so that could come into some use maybe in my future, but I hope not. So I always sort of wonder, when I've got these slides I want to take you through, which is going to be sort of like a history lesson. But I think what I'm going to do today is go through the slides, but first I'm going to tell you about the book, The Saints of Swallow Hill, because then the slides will mean something to you, I think. Who has read the book, or is in the process maybe of reading the book? Okay, so I consider The Saints of Swallow Hill to be my ode to I consider it the origin story for where we got the term Tar Heel. So does anybody know the history behind Tar Heel and why North Carolina is called the Tar Heel State? Anybody familiar with that or think they might know where that came from? So if you don't know, some people think it came from the Civil War, and that's not true. So there is a saying, they stuck in battle like they had tar on their heels. And so that came from the Civil War, and so a lot of people just thought, okay, well, that's where that's from. But it didn't. It's actually from this industry that we had in this state, and we were the top producer of a particular product. So I happened to land on what this product was through my research as I was looking for my next subject after I had written the previous book to The Saints of Swallow Hill. It's called The Moonshiner's Daughter. And so I was on the hunt and search for my next topic, and I ran into what this product was. And so that's what the slide package is about. But The Saints of Swallow Hill is a story of two individuals who experience a life-altering event. And this life-altering event sends them down into a turpentine camp in Valdosta, Georgia, known as Swallow Hill. So my first character is Delwood Reese. And so the chapters in my book alternate between these two main characters, Delwood and Ray Lynn. So when we start off with Del at the beginning of the book, Del is not the best person. He is misbehaving. He is working on a farm, like as a sharecropper, and he is actually not he's a good worker, but you could just say his moral compass is way off. And he does something that makes the boss man extraordinarily mad, and the boss man is out for revenge. And so for that revenge, he decides to make Del go work in a grain bin. Anybody here familiar with grain bins and how dangerous they are? When I first started writing this book, I was on a Zoom call, and I was explaining about the story, and somebody had a friend who, a neighbor down the street, the father and the son had both the week before just perished in a grain bin. So this was the revenge that this owner of the farm where Del was working wanted to set out. He figured if he puts him in a grain bin to work, he'll take care of Del. So Del realized after he had been working for 3 days in 3 different grain bins and he had survived somehow miraculously, that he should leave. And so that's what he ends up doing. And he had worked in turpentine before, and so he heads down to Swallow Hill, thinking that he is going to be able to work there and make his life a little bit easier. And I'm actually talking more to this high school audience. I'm staying safe with this. This is not what I would normally present. But I'm cognizant of the young minds here, so I'm going to explain my book a little differently. And then after we learn about where Dell is going, so the chapters again are swapping back and forth. So then we have Raylyn Cobb. And Raylyn Cobb is working on a small turpentine farm with her husband in North Carolina. And they have a good marriage. Raylyn was living in an orphanage at one point in time, and when she turned 18 and was getting ready to have to leave the orphanage, a man comes along named Warren Cobb, and they strike up a conversation, and they end up getting married. And they lived together, married, husband and wife, for 7 years, working their little turpentine farm. And everything is going along okay, except there's one problem with Warren Cobb, and that is he is a little bit like, if anybody is familiar with the show, they'll know what I'm talking about, Tim the Tool Man Taylor. He is a klutz. He is, I guess you could say, he doesn't think about the consequences of his actions. And because it's a turpentine farm, and OSHA was not around at that time, I don't think, but he ends up putting other people's lives in peril when they work with him, and Raylyn has got the scars to prove it. And it's sort of like poor Warren, you know, he means well, but he's a danger to be around. And so, at any rate, there is a life-altering event, Warren, in his Warren-like way, where there's a storm that blows through, and he decides to get up on the roof of their little cabin, and he falls off of it, and he sustains a life-threatening injury. And this is going to, unfortunately, compel Raylyn to have to make a decision to help Warren end his misery. I'll just leave it like that. Well, she gets blackmailed because of this. And this, in turn, sends her on her own journey where she decides to disguise herself as a man. And she ends up working down in Georgia at the Swallow Hill Turpentine Camp. And so what happens once they get there is sort of like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. Because once they are there, they believe, again, this is Depression era time, so it's really hard already. But what they believe they are doing is going someplace where they will have a roof over their head, food on the table, and they can work until the depression is over. And what they don't realize is the way these turpentine camps are run is under something called a debt peonage system. Who's familiar with that? Anyone familiar? Debt? Okay. So this is where you are always owing more to the boss man, so to speak. It's where you buy things from a commissary and everything is overpriced. So no matter how much you work, you're always indebted to the company that you're working for. Lumber camps operated this way, coal camps operated this way, but what many people didn't realize is that there were such things as these turpentine camps, and they operated the same way. So you go to work for a particular organization that's running the turpentine camp, and they're gonna have, it's almost like a self-contained little city, mini city, where there's churches, a school, you know, cabins where they're living, but everything is, you have to pay for it. You have to pay rent on the cabin where you live. You have to buy your food from the commissary, and they always have it overpriced. So no matter how long you work, and no matter how many hours you put in, you are always in debt. Well, this is where Raylyn and Warren end up. And they will meet one another, their paths will cross. And there's another third character. She doesn't have a point of view in the book, but her name is Cornelia. And in a way, I could say that she almost steals the show. But she and Raylyn will forge a friendship. Raylyn is known as Ray Cobb there. They think he's just a smallish little man. What they don't realize as they get themselves wound up into this lifestyle under this debt peonage system, that it will take everything in them to survive what's known as the Turpentine Camp, Swallow Hill. So that's a little bit about the book. I'm going to go through this slide package because if you read this story, there's a lot of historical fact in it. And so I'm going to go through the slides, and it'll explain a little bit about that Tar Heel origin and what the product was that I was referencing. And I'll probably have some questions. And if you all have any questions at any point in time, then feel free to just raise a hand, ask. It doesn't need to be me just talking at you. We can have it go back and forth, open dialogue. So, ta-da, research behind the story. So it was something called naval stores. Has anybody heard of this before? When I stumbled across this term, I had no idea what it meant. So North Carolina was a top producer in the world from about the mid-1730s to the late 1860s. And the product comes from the longleaf pines. And Russell was kind enough to point out to me, he said when the college was built back in the 60s, the Boy Scouts came and planted all of these pine trees around here, and we were looking at them on the way in, and we're pretty sure those are the longleaf pine. And so that was really interesting to me. And of course, ever since I wrote this book, I am just absolutely fascinated by all the pine trees, because I was only used to seeing these long, thin, skinny pine trees. And then I learned how big they can get, and I had no idea. So essentially, the longleaf pine produces sap, and it's that sap that was tapped, similar to like how you get maple syrup. So they would scrape the trees to make the sap run. And what they would do is distill the gum from the pines and turn it into tar, pitch, and turpentine. And these products, particularly the tar, kept the ropes and the sail rigging from decaying, and the pitch was used on the boat sides and bottom to prevent leaking. When I ran across this term naval stores, I ended up going to a demonstration at Campbell University that was showing how they used to do this back in the 1700s. And interestingly enough, it's distilled in a very, very similar fashion as moonshine. And I knew all about that because I had written The Moonshiner's Daughter, and I had read The Bootlegger's Daughter before that, but from Margaret Meron, if anybody's familiar with her. But anyway, so that was interesting. I was like, okay, so same kind of process. But when the naval stores industry ended, which was, again, kind of the late 1860s, and this is when the iron and steel ships came to be, they still needed the products, and particularly turpentine became the next big commodity. And here's why. People started using it for other reasons than you would think, medicinal purposes. So it was used in, you could think snake oil, you know, that kind of thing. I found these old ads, and I think what's interesting to me about this here is, and you can kind of see it, but I'll read it for those who can't. Here's what it would take care of, supposedly. Neuralgia, headache, sore throat, sprains, cramps, colic, diarrhea, corns, lame back, diphtheria, toothache, pain, and inflammation. And I felt like that's probably because when you took it, if it didn't cure you, it killed you. So, and then you've got this product over here, same thing, coughs, colds, croup, bronchitis, asthma, whooping cough. I mean, it's hard to believe that they would take it, but you can see at the bottom, medicinal purposes often used with dubious results. So, who knows of anyone in their family, like I know my grandfather did this, who used to take a little bit of kerosene with sugar for a cough? Anyone? Anybody that's got grandparents? Did I see a hand? Oh, there's hands up back there. Okay, yeah. There's always at least one or two hands that go up. And it's interesting to me that people would do this, but again, you know, I mean, medicine, it's kind of like what I've always heard, it is called the practice of medicine. And that's because they're always practicing. So This is a chart that shows the historic range of where the longleaf pine used to be, and I've got a chart that follows right after that that shows you where it is now, and it's definitely reduced a lot. So we once had over 90 million acres, approximately 3% now are left, which is about 3 million acres. And it was decimated through the turpentine industry, but then also after the trees were tapped out, the lumber industry would come in and just take them down. The old growth timber, anybody familiar with what a virgin forest is or old growth timber? Okay. I probably want to talk to you after this. Find out where you're learning all your information. So they were also known as mast pines for their strength, the way they would grow so straight and how big they were, so those tall wooden sail ships. So when our country was first developing, down in South Carolina, there is a street called King Street, and there's an area that has like these little emblems, I guess you could say, that is on a particular highway leading into that. And they called it that, and they also called this the King's Tree. And that was because over there, the King of England had declared these trees his because they were all being used as masts when they would replace, you know, like on a wooden sail ship, they would replace the mast with the longleaf pine tree trunks. And so they became known as the King's Tree. And I think there is a King's Tree, South Carolina, but at any rate. Florida currently has the most longleaf pines right now with about 750,000 acres or 25% of the state. So this is how it looks now. And you can see the range where it was previously with the lines going through it. But there are conservation efforts underway. I spoke at the Longleaf Alliance conference, and I learned a lot about, and some of this is not in the book, but I learned a lot about the conservation and the fact that fire is actually very useful for these trees, and fire is what keeps the underbrush from consuming. You know, you can look in a lot of woods and you'll see, like for instance, we have areas close to where I live. I live in Dunn, which is about 2 hours from here. And that's about an hour outside of Southern Pines, Aberdeen, Pinehurst, obvious names right there. And I've got a couple of photos of those areas here in the charts, but they're doing a lot of conservation effort there. And what they do is what they call a controlled burn. And that controlled burn will sweep through, you know, you can see where the burn marks go halfway up the trunk of the tree. But that's very effective at keeping the undergrowth at bay. And there are also a lot of, wildlife and natural flora and fauna that thrives. And there's some species that are actually coming back now, like the red pileated woodpecker loves a longleaf forest. So different species like that are actually recovering because of these conservation efforts. These are two different pictures here. The one on the left actually comes from a book that I have that was given to me when I was on tour last year by a bookseller down in Alabama. And that book is called Longleaf as Far as the Eye Can See. And that's because that's the way it used to be in the states that had the longleaf pine. You could go out there into the woods during the time frames that I've been talking about, 1700s up through maybe even the early 1900s, and probably, I think the turpentine farms were still in existence down in Florida, like in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But at any rate, the gentleman that's standing near the tree, you can see how massive they are. The sad part about that photo, this is taken down in Georgia. He worked for a lumber company, so you know what was getting ready to happen. But the picture on the right is a picture of the conservation efforts. The longleaf forest, the savanna, as they called it, longleaf savannas, were absolutely beautiful. because you could stand there and look out through, and you can still see this. There's some areas that still have this. Not too far from here, if you ever want to take a trip to Pinehurst or any of those areas, you can see what it looks like, because they're doing those controlled burns and they are trying to conserve the longleaf pine tree. Okay, there I am, hugging a tree, giving proof that there are tree huggers out there. So in the one where I'm in the yellow shirt there, this is actually on what's called the James Boyd tract. So if you are familiar with the Weymouth Center for Arts and Humanities, anybody familiar with that location? It's actually the home, the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. That's where that is. Wouldn't I like to be in that one day? But several of our North Carolina authors are, like Lee Smith and Margaret Maron, I believe, is in there. But James Boyd was a writer, and the only book I can think of right now off the top of my head, he was published in 1910, and he wrote a book called Drum. But it's his house that was converted into the Weymouth Center for Arts and Humanities. But this property is part of the Weymouth Center. And so this is called the James Boyd Tract. And that tree that I'm hugging is the oldest longleaf pine tree in the world, according to the Nature Conservancy. And this other tree that I'm standing in front of over here is just another tree that's on there. And the only reason I took these photos was to show you how big they are. This was before I had that book about the longleaf pine. But you can get an idea. And this tree over here on the right is probably only 250 years old. So, you know, they just grew massive. And this is an old turpentine tree. So when you're reading, if you decide to read the books, The Saints of Swallow Hill, if you're not reading it already, these slides actually give you the pictures of some of what I'm talking about in this book, because I try to weave little pieces and parts of the history into the story. So when Ray Lynn and Dell are down in Valdosta, Georgia, working on the Swallow Hill Turpentine Camp, they are doing this work here. And I thought it would help people to know, because I had questions coming in from people who had read the book. I don't understand what you mean by chipping a tree and cat face. And who's familiar with the term cat face? I'm gonna look at you. Do you know what the cat faces are? I'm gonna show you here in a minute. Anybody else know what a cat face tree is? Okay. Well, anyway, this is an old turpentine tree, and the tree is actually trying to heal, and this is also on the Boyd tract. This is it. This is a cat face, and you can distinctly see it in this picture right here. So what they would do is, when they were trying to chip the tree to get the gum to run so they could collect the gum, and then they would transport it down the river, a lot of times to Wilmington, transport it right down the Cape Fear River to Wilmington, and it would be distilled. I actually learned after I wrote the book, and this has happened to me more than once, where I finish a book and then somebody will come up to me and say, "Did you know?" And so that happened with this book. I found out that Dunn, where I live right now, used to be an old distillery for pine gum. And after I wrote The Moonshiner's Daughter, I found out that my grandfather was a bootlegger. And that came from an aunt. But anyway, this is the cat face, and what you're looking at here, and you can just barely see it maybe depending on where you're sitting, this is 10 little tin strips, and right there is a clay cup. It looks like those little clay flower pots, and that's what they're collecting the gum in, and that was actually something called the Hurdy system. So there was a guy named Charles Hurdy that developed this, and the reason he developed this is because originally they were doing something called the box method, which was down here at the base of the tree. And when they would chip the tree, and once they started getting up real high, and there's a pointer on here, and I'm just pointing with my finger. But anyway, they would, the gum would have to run all that distance, and a lot of times it would dry, and then it would be not good quality gum, because it was picking up all the trash on the way down the tree. And then sometimes it would harden, and they'd have to scrape it off, so it literally became something called scrape. But that's what the cat faces look like. And so to shorten that distance of the pine gum running, gave them more pine gum quicker, and it was cleaner. But not everybody adopted this method. So this guy was a dipper, and he's got a bucket there, and this is essentially what he was doing. He was scraping the gum, literally, out of a container. Now that's not that clay cup I just showed you. But here's the thing. They were expected to dip anywhere like up to 2,000 cups a day. They were also expected to chip a tree, 1,800 to 2,000 per day. Now you might figure, how could one individual possibly do that? And that's where my IT brain kicked in. And because I was curious too, I was like, well, how would that happen? So if you think about it, if you take a 10-hour day and you divide that into 1,800, that's 180. I basically came up with they were probably doing about 3 trees a minute. So they would do 1 tree every 20 seconds. And they were so close together that they could, walk to the next tree. And a skilled worker could take a bark hack. The tool they're using is called a bark hack. And it's like got a long wooden handle, and it's got this metal end to it. And they would take and strike the tree just right, and they knew how to do it where it wouldn't go too deep, and then they scrape it one way, and then they scrape it the other way, and it would form a chevron. And this is what they did, like just one time. That's all they had to do, and the sap would start running. And so then they'd usually start at the bottom, and if they were doing the boxing method at the base of the tree, they would just start there and work their way up. If they were using the tin gutter system with the clay cups, then they would maybe raise that up a little bit, but they would strike the tree and the chevron, sap would run, and it would go into the cup. But anyway, that's how I came to 1,800 to 2,000, because if you think about it, during the warmer weather, when the sap is running, you easily got a 10-hour day, but they were probably they had a term or a saying, they worked from camped to camped. The point being, they couldn't hardly get up in the morning. They were so tired, and they still had to work till they couldn't hardly work anymore. So a lot of long hours, and I mean, you can imagine in the South, we all know about the humidity, we know about the bugs, the gnats, and then there was the wildlife they had to contend with. Depending on what state you were in, snakes, definitely in most states, but the alligators. So they had it rough. And then their conditions were very squalid. This guy is a typical woods rider or a boss man. So this was about the only picture I could find of somebody that was doing this work. So they tended to ride through the woods and check on the men that were doing the work. They kept tabs on how much they were working and what their quota was. They had to meet quota. And if they didn't meet quota, it could mean severe punishment. There were brutal beatings in these camps, and there was something also called a sweat box. And I got an article on that I'll show you here in a minute. But this is a typical turpentine camp. Now this actually looks really good compared to most of the shotgun shacks that I saw that they would be living in. These little homes here do not look that bad. This actually comes from a historian. His name is David Soselski, and I tend to like to go to his site because he puts out a lot of really good, neat photographs, and I found one here. So this just gives you an idea of what a camp would look like, and you can see the trees off there in the distance. And so here is a sweat box. So this was just a very barbaric method of punishment. This is in the book. There are some really tough scenes in the book dealing with the sweat box. This article was actually printed in 1945. So they were still using this method even then. So that's basically it for the slide package. This is my next novel that comes out in January of 2024. It's called When the Jessamine Grows. Before I tell you about that book, Is there anybody that has any questions for me?
Hey, question about how they got to the tops of the trees. Do you happen to know?
How they got?
How did they climb to the top of the trees to get this out?
They never worked, they stood on the ground. They never, they didn't climb. And if they had to go, like they had the tool that was the bark hack, they had one that had a longer handle on it. And so they would reach up, and there's a scene in the book that deals with that, and Ray Cobb as a man, she deals with a situation where she's given that task to do. And
I haven't gotten there yet.
okay, I'm not going to tell you about it. No spoilers. I try to have spoiler-free.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Did they ever replant any of them so they would have more down the road? They didn't need to.
Probably not in the time frame of this book during the Depression. They eventually came back in. Now, again, like for instance, and I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that until after I wrote the book and learned about the decimation, with longleaves. But I feel like the conservation efforts didn't really get started until, the realization that we are losing that important understory. Yeah, so they wouldn't usually go back. They would have a lumber company come in and they would move on. If you were working in a turpentine camp, you just moved it's like I say in the book, like the birds fly in the south, they migrated down to wherever the work, they could open up a camp and have the work. Any other questions for me? And it doesn't have to be about the book. I'm here to answer questions about publishing, about writing, about anything you want to know. So published, this is the 6th book, but I have 2 other books that I wrote, so I've written a total of 8 books. And the other 2 books that I wrote, one of them went on submission, and it was a very, very different book from these. It was a hard crime novel about the Dixie Mafia. Has anybody ever heard about the Dixie Mafia? A lot of people haven't, that's why I wrote about it. But anyway, it's probably not going to see the light of day on a bookshelf, so there's that. And then I wrote another book that has never been on submission before, and so I always kind of hold that one in my back pocket when I'm thinking of times when I don't know what I'm going to write next. I might pull it out. But altogether, 8 and 6 have been published, and I'm working on my 7th book that's under contract. One thing I'll say about my writing, some of you that are reading the book now, and if it's the first book you've ever read by me, I will say that all of my books are not soft, sweet stories. If that's the kind of book you're looking for, I'm not your writer. I like Cormac McCarthy, but I don't write like Cormac McCarthy. Who's read him? Who has read any Cormac McCarthy books? Okay, back there. I like him, and I like Ron Rash and Kay Gibbons. I'm a big, big fan of Kay Gibbons and Dorothy Allison and Paulette Giles. Paulette Giles, I would say when the Jessamine Grows, I was heavily influenced by her stories of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. And that's actually when this book takes place. It takes place just at the very beginning before North Carolina is about to secede. But it's a very different story because it's set during the Civil War, but it's not about the Civil War. It's about the people who are left behind. And I actually have a quote from an Iraqi American activist, and her last name is Salbi. She's a podcaster, she's a writer, she's a journalist, and she said, if we are to understand war, then we need to understand not only what happens on the front lines, but what happens on the back lines as well, where women are in charge of keeping life going. And that's essentially what this book is about. Joetta McBride is married to Ennis. They're raising 2 sons. The story takes place in Nash County, North Carolina. And again, it's just before North Carolina. They haven't seceded yet, so it starts in 1861. And they are living as subsistence farmers. Anybody familiar with the term subsistence or yeoman farmers? This is where they grow. For those of you that don't know, this is where they grow enough food to feed their livestock and themselves. So they are self-supporting. The father-in-law, Rudine McBride, is a staunch Confederate supporter, and he influences the oldest boy, Henry. And Henry runs off to join, like many of the young men did back then. But Joetta and her husband are neutral. They don't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, they don't, they're there on their farm, and this is where their focus is, to grow their crops and to feed their family and raise their family, and that's all they care about. So they inadvertently get caught up in it. And Joetta maintains her stance. Even after Ennis takes off, he goes to look for their oldest boy. And before long, because Joetta doesn't conform to the thinking of the day, she is considered a pariah. And that's basically what the story is about. We have some early praise on the story from librarians and booksellers. So a couple of them say, like with South Main Book Company in Salisbury, she says, it's Alyssa Redmond, and she says, I could relate to this character's struggle to remain true to her values while worrying about survival. I hope this book will give many readers new insight into the complexities of Southern women's existence during the Civil War and shed some light on those important stories. And then from the Lake Travis Community Library out of Austin, Texas. This is not a Gone with the Wind story glamorizing the heroic Southern cause, but instead a story of a woman with a tenacious spirit who stood by her convictions even when going forward seems impossible. Absorbing historical fiction. So anyway, those are just some of the early comments from readers that my publicist sent the book out to. And hopefully you all will consider reading it at some point in time. So that's basically, yes, I was going to say I'll take more questions now because that's basically the end of the slide. Sure.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit of how you made the jump from being in IT to writing.
Yeah, boy, that was a... So, it's, you know how they say you think sometimes things happen for a reason? It's okay. I'm going to get, but I'll remember you have a question. What happened with that is I had been working at Nortel. Anybody familiar with the company Nortel or Northern Telecom? Way back in the back, okay. So I'd been there for 25 years and they went bankrupt. So there's nothing more, alarming than the company that you believe you're going to retire from. I would still be there in my little cubicle doing new product introduction and writing technical manuals. I was writing technical manuals at the time. Here's how you do this, to get a product to work. I'd still be there probably. So that was like the proverbial shove. That's a very Reader's Digest condensed version of it, but what was going on with timeline is that was in 2008. And so when they decided to go bankrupt, I told my husband, if I'm ever gonna do anything about the writing, now is the time. And so I had this manuscript that had been sitting on my laptop for, 10, 15 years, because at some point in time I had thought, I'm gonna write a book, just a very, broad way of saying that I was gonna do something. It's like I ran 2 marathons. I said I ran 2 marathons. I'm going to run a marathon, and that's what you do, is you make the declaration, and then you kind of have to hold yourself to that promise. So it was kind of the same thing with the book writing. I loved reading. I've always been first and foremost a reader all my life, ever since I figured out that the alphabet, these were letters, and these letters made words, and these words went into sentences, and those sentences could tell me a story. That was it for me. My mother could not keep enough books in my hand. So at some point I had made this declaration of, I'm going to write a book one day. I had 85 pages of a manuscript sitting on my desktop back in 2008. And when the company went bankrupt, they didn't immediately go under, but they were Chapter 11, so they sold off parts of the business, and I stayed with them until they literally kind of like kicked me out the door, which took them about almost 4 years. So I didn't leave until 2012. And in the meantime, while I was still working for them as they sold off parts of the business, and I was working to help shut them down, I worked on the manuscript. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And when it came time to leave, I had been working with a freelance editor for about a year to polish up that manuscript. And she worked with agents in New York, and she did what she called exclusive submissions to those agents. And the third one picked me up. And that manuscript that I had sitting on my laptop, for who knows how long, years, decades, it seemed like, is what became The Education of Dixie Dupree, my debut novel that came out in 2016. So even though I picked up an agent in 2012, close to the time that I left Nortel, the book didn't sell for 3 years. So there was that. And that's kind of, again, there's a lot more to it. But yes, ma'am. It's okay.
But the Great Depression, how prominent does it play a role with the telling of the story? And another part is that when you were speaking about the punishment for not meeting the quota, that was like all new information.
Okay.
And I was really surprised that it lasted up until 1945, which we know that that's going to bring the United States out of the Great Depression. So how does all of that play in the book?
So the story takes place throughout. It's all during the Depression, but it's a compressed time frame as far as the actual story itself goes. And that's what drives a lot of the decisions on the work that people accepted back then, because there was hardly any work. So you might question, why would anybody consider going to work in such a brutal environment? And I don't know exactly when you came in, but at the very beginning when I was talking about the book, I had mentioned that the 2 characters have got life-altering events, and I kind of shied away from too many details on that because of the audience that I have here today. But at any rate, in the fact that they were, more or less bound by that time and what was going on at that time. I remember, as I was researching this, looking at pictures of people who looked like they were starving because they would probably only get like the soup lines, and so they would maybe get like a cup of soup to eat and a piece of bread. And it was usually the men who were getting this food, because it would be the men mostly who would be doing the work. So as far as the Depression goes, it's the backdrop, for the book. It's set during that time. And then when it comes to the brutality and the length of time that this went on, and it actually could have gone on even longer than that 1945 time frame when that sweatbox was being used, because some of these turpentine camps were private. They were owned by people who owned the land, and the workers would come in And if they were working under a debt peonage system, it's bad to say this, it's not a good thing to say this, but they would sometimes be in cahoots with the local law enforcement. And so, for instance, if somebody did not meet quota, a lot of times they would try to run because they would realize, I'm never going to get out of this. I'm never going to, be able to pay back. I'm never going to get out of debt. So I'm just going to leave. Well, they would send word out. They would send the word out that this person has escaped the camp and be on the lookout for them. And the way it was looked at back then, a camp owner could do just about what he wanted to do to that particular individual if and when they were returned. A lot of times, if they were killed, and they oftentimes were, they could dump the body off in the swamp somewhere, and if family came to look for them, they would say, we don't know where he went. He ran off and we've not seen him since. So, does that answer the question?
Yes, and it brings me to another question. So was one of your resources that you used the book Slavery by Another Name, because that also speaks about the judicial branch used that for these business owners to get the work and the brutality of that work. And you would have been doing that same time as well.
I did not use that, but, and I actually wished I had brought my knapsack. I had my backpack that I usually carry my laptop in, but there were 2 thesis papers that I used as my research. And a lot of times I bring those thesis papers out, and I didn't even think about that when we were talking about sharing my PowerPoint. I sent Russell over here my PowerPoint so he could just put it up here and I didn't have to bring my laptop with me. But I used these 2 thesis papers, and one of them was called Pining for Turpentine, and it was written by a guy named Timothy Kreiser, and he was working towards his thesis. Yeah, and I can't remember all of the details, but that was one paper that I used. And then there was another thesis paper that I was using, and I can't recall the title of it, but it dealt with debt peonage in the industrial South, something like that. But no, I've heard of what you're talking about, but I did not use that as a resource. You're welcome. Are there any other questions? Any questions from the writers in the group here up front?
There's one right here.
I was just wondering, like, what do publishers look for in stories?
Where are you at? I don't see who's asking me the question. Oh, you? Okay, hey. It varies, really. And depending on what you're writing, one thing that I will say to the writers in the room, there may be some of you who don't want to admit it, so kudos to the ones that were brave enough to raise their hands. Read what you want to write, because that will show you how it's done. When it comes to the publishing industry in of itself, it's a moving target. You never know what's going to be the next big hit. I can tell you this right now, Where the Crawdads Sing, that book, that sold, I don't know, last I saw it was 12 million copies, and that was before the movie was made, so I don't know where that is right now. That publisher only ordered 20,000 copies, and actually that's a big print run, but they ordered originally 20,000 copies of that book because they didn't think it was going to take off the way it did. And lo and behold, we all sort of thought that the Southern, genre, everybody had done what they thought they were going to do, and, where are we going to get fresh new stories from, which is kind of why I tackled this, because nobody has written about a turpentine camp before. Nobody knew the origin story of Tar Heel. So, at any rate, the publishing industry is fickle. My advice to anybody that is trying to write is write the book of your heart, write the book that you want to read, that's the thing, right? I write what I like to read. I like harsh, brutal, tough stories where I love nothing better than to put my characters in peril and to watch them get out of that trouble. It's what I like to read. And anybody that knows anything about Cormac McCarthy, the fact that I would admit that I like Cormac McCarthy because he is pretty depraved in his writing. So, but I like that, you know? I mean, it's just showing humanity. It's showing life, because life isn't all about everything being perfect and everything being easy. It's about it being hard and tough sometimes. And you all are in high school, you know that. It's tough being in high school. I remember. Anybody else have any questions for me? This one, I saw a hand.
When's the movie coming out?
Oh gosh, don't I wish? It seems like I see that kind of stuff, you know. So when it comes to movies, the question was, when's the movie coming out? I would love to have a book option for a movie. I get people write to me a lot about that. I think it should be a movie. Well, I think it should be too. Any of them, I don't care which one. But a lot of times what happens is the books get optioned and then the movie is never made, you know? And then sometimes the movie is made, and I know a writer right now from North Carolina who's familiar with David Joy. Has anybody read anything by David Joy? I was trying to think of some of his titles, and I've got them at the house. When These Mountains Burn was one of his titles. But anyway, one of his books was turned into a movie, and Billy Bob Thornton starred in it, and I can't recall who else. And they filmed it, but it has yet to be released. And I want to say they filmed it like 2 or 3 years ago. So it's really weird, you know, how that works. But yes, I would love to have that happen.
You have time to sign?
I do.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you.